All right, guys, so we can now register a user. Now, I want to make it clear that we're not going to keep this here, this Axios. When we implement Redux, we want all of this to be done through the Redux action, not actually in the component. Okay, we're just testing out the API and also just setting up the, now we're going to set up the error handling, which will really not change after we implement Redux. But this will. We're not going to make it. What's going to change is where we make the request. Okay, but the actual method of request and all that, that'll be the same. So let's go ahead, and when we get the error, instead of just logging it, we want to set it to our state. We want to set it to the errors object. So let's get rid of console log here, and instead we're going to say this dot set state, and we want to set the errors in our state to error.response.data, which is an actual errors object, and we're going to set that to our state. All right, now once that's done, it's not going to show us anything. It will be set to the state, but now what we want to do is output those state values, okay, the error state values inside our inputs, or under our inputs rather. Now, we're also going to be implementing the form validation in Bootstrap. In fact, maybe we should look at that in case you're not aware of how that works. So if we go to, let's see, components, forms, and validation, basically you want to check for an error, and if you want that field to have an error, then you want it to have a class of isInvalid. Okay, the input should have that class. Actually, let's look at the code. It's probably easier. And here's a good example. So isInvalid will give your input a red outline. Now this text underneath comes from a div with invalid feedback as a class. Now this doesn't show by default. It only shows if you have isInvalid as a class on your input. Okay, otherwise this won't show. So we have to implement some logic to say if there's an error, like let's say the name isn't required, then we want to add the isInvalid class, and we want this message to show. All right, so to do that, let's take a look at our form. To do that, we need to have basically a variable class name, because we only want isInvalid. I can actually show you now if I put is-invalid as a class here and go back to our form, it has a red outline. So we basically need a conditional class. So React doesn't have anything by default. I'm just gonna undo that. React doesn't have anything by default to do that, so we have to install a package called class names, which will allow us to have conditional class names. So let's go to our other terminal here, and we're going to do we are in the client directory. Okay, make sure you're in the client directory. We're going to do npm install class names. Okay, and this will allow us to basically say if a certain something is true, then add this class to it. Okay, it's something that we can actually do in Angular. If you're familiar with Angular, we can do this without any extra packages. But React is, a quote-unquote library, so it doesn't have everything we need. All right, let's go ahead and just go back to the other terminal. And now that we have class names installed, we're going to just import it. So let's go up here and let's import, let's see, is it class names? Yeah, it's not camel case, it's just class names from class names. Okay, so now that we bring that in, we're going to go down to, let's see, our render. Now, if we have errors, they'll be in this.state.errors. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a little destructuring here, and I'm going to say const, and if we put curly braces around errors, we can just pull it out of this dot state like that. Okay, so we're going to be using this quite a bit. It's the same as doing this. Errors equals this dot state dot errors. Okay, think of it as using these curly braces allows you to pull errors out of this dot state instead of assigning it directly. All right, so now we have error. We have the error state in this variable. So what we want to do is let's go to the first input, which is our name input. And where we have class name, I'm going to just redo this. Now we still want these form control large classes. We still want those. So what we can do is we can set this to a set of curly braces and put in class names, and then open a set of parentheses, and we can put default class names, meaning these will always be in effect. So form control and form control -LG. Okay, those, we always want those class names. Now our second parameter, which is going to go right here, will be an object, or we'll open up some curly braces, and we're going to have a class which is invalid. Okay, so is_invalid is the class we want only if we have a value of errors.name. Okay, so let me just try to explain what's going on. These classes will always be here just as they were, just as they are down here, but is_invalid is only going to be here if errors.name exists. Now errors is coming from our state. All right, and when we make our request, that errors object is being filled. And if there isn't a name, then errors.name is going to exist. And this is all because of how we set it up in our back end. If we look at our route here, we're setting, actually if we look in our validation and we go to, let's see, register, this is where we actually created errors.name. Okay. So it could be this if it's you know, one character or more than 30. If it's not there, then we'll get this in errors.name. So it depends on which validator it hits. Okay, we can also check for errors.email, password, and so on, and we're going to do that as well for the other inputs. But it's going to see if errors.name is there, and if it is, then it's going to give it the is_invalid class, which will just make the outline red. We can actually try that now. So if we save this and we go and we try to submit without a name, there it is, it's red. So for the message underneath, we're going to want that, right? Because they're not going to know, you know, I mean, it's kind of obvious here, but there might be a situation where they might not know exactly what the error is. So as I said before, the class of invalid feedback is what we're going to use to show the error. Okay, but we only want that to show if there's an errors.name. So we'll go right under the input. We're going to put in some curly braces so we can use a JavaScript expression. We're going to say errors.name double ampersand, so and then we'll open up a set of parentheses, and we're going to return div class name equals invalid dash feedback. All right, now if you're watching this in the future and let's say Bootstrap 5 is out and these classes no longer apply, then you're going to have some UI problems. Okay, it's going to have nothing to do with React unless they update their API. But what I would suggest doing, if let's say Bootstrap 5 is out, is I would suggest using the version that we're using here, just so you can follow along, because this is really irrelevant to the MERN stack. This is just what we're using for our UI. All right, now in this invalid feedback, we need a message, and that message is actually stored in errors.name. So we can simply do that. All right, so now if we go and try this out, Let's hit submit, and there we go. Name field is required. So this is actually coming from our back end, but it's being displayed on our front end, okay, because we sent that along with the 400 response. So now we just want to do that to all of our fields. So what I'll do is copy this whole class name, and we'll go to the next one. We'll replace this, except this time we want errors.email. And we'll do it for the next one, class name. Whoops, I just copied that by mistake. So class name. And this one is going to be, this is password, so errors.password. Next one. This is password 2. Okay, so that'll take care of the red outline. Now we need the message, so I'm going to copy this from the first one we did. And we'll go down, let's see, is this going to go under the info? No, we'll put it above the info. So right here, except you want to change this to email. Okay, for this one here, let's paste it in right under the input. Change this to password. Oh, one thing I forgot is to change this to email as well. Okay, and we'll change this to password. Should always match the field. And then this last one under input, we're going to change it to password 2. Change this to password 2. All right, so now our validation should work. So if I submit, there we go, we get all of our errors. If I put in the name and I resubmit, that error is gone. If I put in an email that isn't an actual email, we're going to get the HTML5 here. Actually, if you don't want that, we could simply put in to our form tag, we could say no validate. That way it won't give those types of errors. Whoops, it should be camel case, sorry. Where is it? So no validate. So now even if it's not a valid email, now we just get our message and not the HTML5 one. If I put a valid email and submit, that error goes away. If I put in, let's put in passwords that don't match, we get passwords must match. So our error checking is working perfectly. Now, I think before we move on, we want to start to implement Redux, because I don't want to start to do like the login and all that, because we're not actually going to be sending our request to our server from our component. Okay, we want to do that from a Redux action, and then when we get the response, we're going to send it down through a Redux reducer. Okay, and then it'll hit this component. We're still going to fill the state, the error state, and I'll show you how we'll do that later. So none of this will change. Like this here, we'll still get it from the state. We're still going to have class name. This is all going to stay the same. The only difference is the way that we make this request and the way that we get the response. All right, so in the next section, we're going to start to implement Redux.